Hi, I'm Mindy Mandell, and thank you for joining me for this last video of 2021. And what better way to round out the year than with a look at the Greek gods? What I want to look at specifically in this video is how we as Platonists can bring some intelligibility to our reading of these mythological stories, which at least on the surface just seem bizarre. Now, Plato, throughout his dialogues, writes about the gods, saying, for example, that they are good. Here's a quote from the Republic, where Socrates says that the true quality of God we must always surely attribute to him, whether we compose in epic, melic, or tragic verse. We must, Eudemon says. And then Socrates goes on to say, and is not God, of course, good in reality, and always to be spoken of as such? Certainly. So Socrates says here that God is good, and in fact he goes on to say that when we develop spiritual maturity, it flowers as virtue, and the fullest flowering of virtue is to become as godlike as is humanly possible. This is the image that he has of the philosopher king, of the sage, is to be as godlike as is humanly possible. Well, if that is true, and we read the mythological stories, which, at least on the surface, present the gods as being brutal and callous and jealous and so on, we'd have to conclude that the sages among us, the people among us who are most godlike, are the ones who fill up maximum security prisons, or the brutal warlords and dictators and tyrants. But of course, we know that's not at all what Plato was advocating. That's not what he means. That's not what Socrates is talking about. So there must be another way to read mythology, to understand the gods in a way that is consistent with Plato's teachings. Well, one philosopher who can help us here is Proclus. Proclus mentions the gods throughout all of his commentaries on Plato's dialogues. He has a whole section in his Elements of Theology that deal with propositions specifically about the gods. He also writes about the gods in his Theology of Plato. So drawing from his teachings, I put together a few points that I think every Platonist ought to have in mind when we're approaching mythology. So the first thing to keep in mind is that the gods are divine. But we don't say this in like the warm, fuzzy feeling sort of way. We say this in a metaphysical sense because the gods are an emanation from the One. They get their divinity from the One. Also, the gods are beyond being. They're beyond essence. We say in metaphysics that they are super essential. Super meaning beyond, and essential as an essence. So they're beyond essence. Collectively, the gods are a unity, but they fall short of the majesty of the One. Sometimes when we're speaking loosely, we may say that the gods are aspects of the One, but it's not quite accurate because the One is beyond even the unity of all of the gods together collectively. So metaphysically, they fall somewhere between the One itself and the first truly existing being. Now, one way to approach mythology is to see the gods as representing divine function. Each time a different function is used, a different god is mentioned. So the personifications are really just symbolism or imagery. Many atheists like to point out that if you could ask a pig what God looks like, the pig would think that God looks like a pig, and a horse would think God is a horse, and so on. And so they point to that as saying that this notion of, these human forms is silly, whether you're looking at the biblical God or you're looking at the mythological gods. They think that that's a reason to dismiss God and conclude that there is no God. We say, no, that's not what we conclude, but we do see these human forms as symbolism, as a personification, if you will, of these divine forces. And so when we're reading mythology, we want to think about what is the function that is being symbolized through these characters. And we want to see how the gods interact with each other and how they interact with humans. Now, in metaphysics, the gods are called henads. And henad is really just the Greek word for oneness, because the first emanation from the One would be oneness. What is most similar to one would be oneness. However, we also know from previous videos that the One equals the good. Therefore, these onenesses must also be goodnesses. And that brings us to the last point I want to make right here, which is that providence, the goodness that flows through all the realms of reality, is primarily in the gods. So the gods that are representing that unfolding, if you will, of goodness. Now, of course, if you read the stories of mythology, it's very hard to see these brutal and cruel and jealous gods as being goodnesses or spreading goodness. And so we have to see a way of how to read these stories to not to justify the horrible behavior on the surface, but to see the goodness and providential flow of these divine forces as the undercurrent, if you will, of what is guiding the story. So I'm going to give some examples so that we can see how to read these stories in a way that is consistent with Platonism, that brings some intelligibility to them. So one god I want to look at is Apollo, because Apollo is a very important god in Plato's dialogues. He is the god who Socrates himself says that he is a follower of. Here's a quote from the Phaedo. This is the dialogue where this takes place on the last day of Socrates' life, and he's explaining why he does not fear death. He's talking in this particular section about the swans. They sing a song called the Swan Song. We, famously say that somebody singing their swan song, we think of it as a sad song. But Socrates says, no, the swan song is actually a happy song. Now, Apollo, by the way, is the god of music, and he's known for archery and many things. He's also a prophetic god, and that's important for this particular quote. So Socrates says that since the swans are Apollo's birds, I believe they have prophetic vision. And because they have foreknowledge of the blessings in the other world, they sing and rejoice on that day more than ever before. I think that I myself am a fellow servant of the swans, and I am consecrated to the same God. So Socrates also follows Apollo. And I have received from our master a gift of prophecy no whit inferior to theirs. Okay, so this prophetic vision that Apollo had, there are many stories dealing with it, and one maybe very famous story that you may have heard of is his encounter with Cassandra. Cassandra was a Trojan priestess, and Apollo, in most versions of the story, he approaches her, offering her the gift of prophecy, is a way of courting her. But he tells her that he would only give her this prophecy if she agrees to have sex with him, because of course he did. And she, wanting this gift, agrees to go along with it, even though she had no intention of actually having sex with him. So she says, okay, go ahead, I'll give me the prophecy. I want to have the gift of prophecy, but I want you to give it to me before I have sex with you. If you give me this gift, then afterwards, she agrees to have sex with him. So he figures, well, nobody would lie to a god or try to trick a god, so he goes ahead and gives her the gift of prophecy. After giving it to her, she turns around and says, you know what, I changed my mind. She's not going to have sex with him after all. Well, he's very angry. And so he decides he cannot take away the gift of prophecy, by the way, so that's a divine law. And I think it points to the idea that once we open our channel, our ability to participate in nous, once we raise our energy to that level, we always have that ability. Once we gain it, we don't lose it, even in future lifetimes. And so he cannot take away the gift of prophecy, but he decides he's going to curse her. So he says, well, how about just a kiss? And she figures, well, okay, that's fair. But instead of kissing her, when he gets close to her, he spits in her mouth, which I guess is the way to seal the curse. And the curse that he puts on her is that nobody will ever believe her prophecies. And so from this, we get the idea of a Cassandra as a person who is far-seeing, but nobody believes the person. So that's the basic story. Now, how can we understand the story in a way that is intelligible? Because at least on the surface, neither one of these characters is acting in a very honorable way. One thing that we can see here, now, of course, among humans, if a man tells a woman that he'll only do her a favor if she has sex with him, we'd say this guy is a cat and nobody's going to defend the guy. But in mythology, what we can see here is that when a human has sex with a god, it symbolizes a raising of energy. Now, many people, they want divine gifts. They love the idea of having this prophetic vision or being able to see energy, or, there are many divine gifts that just sound cool. It impresses our friends and makes us feel wise, and we stand out. And so people want these gifts, but in actuality, there is a certain level of work that we have to do on ourselves. It's a manifestation of our inner state of mind and the state of our soul. And so in order to use these gifts in a way that is truly beneficial, we have to do that commensurate level of work. And that's really what is symbolized by this idea of raising energy. He offers her the gift, but says she must raise her energy along with it. That would be the metaphysical reading of it. I'm not defending, his actual approaches if you look at these as people, but that would be the metaphysical reading. She refused to do that. She wanted the gift without the commensurate level of wisdom that would be required to use the gift in a way that is beneficial and providential in the world. And so it didn't work out very well for her. Now, another story about Apollo that actually shows his brutality and cruelty in an even more stark way would be the story of his musical competition with the satyr Marsyas. Marsyas was a satyr, which means he's half horse, half human. That's why the lower half of his body looks weird. He comes across some pipes which were left by Athena. In most versions of the story, they may have even been cursed by her. He starts playing beautiful music with these pipes, more beautiful than any music he's ever played before. And he goes around playing this music, and everybody is so amazed by it. Some people even tell him that his music is so beautiful that it rivals that of Apollo. And Marsyas makes the mistake of conceit, and he says, yes, he agrees that his music is as beautiful, maybe more beautiful than Apollo's. Well, Apollo hears this, and of course he's jealous and angry, and he wants a competition. Now, Apollo plays the lyre, which you see him holding here in this drawing. He challenges Marsyas to a musical competition, and they have the muses be the judges. So they each play a number of different songs, and song after song, the muses are so impressed that they decide it is a tie. Apollo is not willing to leave it as a tie. So he takes it a step further. He says, let's each play a song upside down. Marsyas foolishly agrees, and I say foolishly because he was playing a wind instrument which cannot be played well upside down. His song is a failure, and he ends up losing the competition. The lyre could be played upside down, but not the pipes. And that's significant to this story because Apollo wins, and now he gets to choose the punishment for Marsyas. And what he chooses is quite brutal. He chooses for Marsyas to be put to death, but in a most painful way. And here's a picture of him being tied up, and the order is for Marsyas to be skinned alive. Now, why such a brutal story? What does this possibly mean? How can we possibly look at this story of Apollo being jealous and petty and then brutal at the end and see anything providential, anything good or beautiful here? Well, one reading of this story that I have heard, one explanation of the metaphysics behind it, is that the pipes, because of their physical limitations of not being able to be played upside down, represent our physical world. And the beauty of music in our physical world, the harmony, the rhythm, and so on of music, no matter how beautiful it is in our physical world, it can never rival divine beauty, which is what Apollo represents with his lyre. So Marsyas made the mistake of thinking that beauty in this realm could ever rival the beauty of the divine realm, which means he did not know divine beauty. He was limited to the understanding of beauty in this physical world, and so he only knew beauty in that relative sense, that this music was more beautiful than music he'd played on other instruments. And that is his only understanding of beauty. And so another way to understand this skinning alive of Marsyas is that the way for Apollo to raise Marsyas to know divine beauty is there must be a separation from the body. And that is what is symbolized by the flaying. So a rather brutal image, but it sometimes maybe the brutality of these stories is what makes them memorable and allows us to remember the metaphysical lesson that is at the root. That's one reason, perhaps, for the brutality of these stories. Also, I think, just my idea is that the childishness of these gods also makes it easy to remember, because the motivations of the gods, it's very easy to understand. You don't have to have a complex understanding of human psychology to understand this jealousy. So I suspect that that's why the gods are childlike. Okay, another example I want to look at is Persephone. Now, Persephone is also important in Plato's dialogue. She's mentioned a few times. She's mentioned in the Meno, for example, somewhere around 80 or 81. She's mentioned as being wise. And here also in the Cratylus, she's mentioned as wise. She goes by a few different names, by the way. And in this quote, she's called Fata, which is actually the same goddess. In English, we call her Persephone in the English-speaking world. And in Latin, she has another name as well. But here in this quote, we see that he's talking here about the etymology, by the way, for those of you not familiar with the Cratylus. This is the dialogue where Socrates, runs through a number of different words, names of gods, and also words like wisdom and intellect. And he gives some idea of the etymology behind them. This section, by the way, also mentions Apollo, but here I just want to focus on Persephone. So he says, in Fata, how many people fear this name? And he says a little about the etymology. And then he says that actually Farapatha or something of that sort would be the correct name of the goddess, because she is wise and she touches that which is in motion. And this is the reason why Hades, who is wise, consorts with her, because she is wise. But people have altered her name, attaching more importance to euphony than to truth, and they call her Fata. Okay, so who is this goddess, and what exactly is her relationship with Hades? Well, here what Socrates calls consorting with her, we in our modern sensibilities would call rape, which makes this story another one that is very uncomfortable, at least on the surface, and certainly cannot be defended if you look at these characters as people. So we have to first look at what the story is and then think about how we can possibly find anything providential or beautiful in this story. So the basic story is that Persephone, and by the way, her Latin name is something like Proserpine. And so in Romance languages, and you can see the sculptor is Italian, in Romance languages, her name is something similar to that. So here in Italian, apparently it's Proserpina, but we call her Persephone in English, which I'm glad of because it's the easiest one to pronounce. Okay, so Persephone is the daughter of Zeus and the goddess Demeter, who is the goddess of the harvest, and that becomes important in the story. So she is a sweet, young, innocent virgin. One day she's frolicking through a field of flowers when Hades sees her and he falls madly in love. He goes to his brother Zeus and says he's in love with his daughter Persephone, can he take her? And Zeus gives his permission. So the ground opens, up comes Hades. He terrifies the young girl, but he grabs her and kicking and screaming, he pulls her down to his world of Hades. Demeter finds out and she is very angry. She threatens to cause a famine because she is the goddess of the harvest. She's going to kill off the human race, which Zeus loves. And so there's some back and forth, and finally Zeus concedes and he says, okay, let's make a deal here. And what he ordains is that Persephone is to spend part of the year in the world of Hades as the queen of the underworld. And then in the spring, she returns to the earth again a virgin. And her mother, happy again, allows the harvest to bloom. And so in part, the story does explain things like the cycle of when, like in the winter when there's no harvest, the mother is sad because Persephone is down in the world of Hades. Okay, so there's that kind of explanation, which was often on the surface, and maybe many local, and people in the countryside accepted this version of the story, and they never looked deeper. But Platonists, of course, want to look for the metaphysics under the story. So how can we look at this story, see the way the men treated the women here, and see anything providential or good here? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that Hades was not seen as a devil figure. He's called wise, in fact, in that past quote. He's not a devil figure. His world, the world of Hades, includes Tartarus, which was the place of punishment, but it also included the Eleusinian Fields, or sometimes called the Isles of the Blessed, which was the place of reward. It also included the place of judgment, where the souls first went when it was decided who would go up and who would go down. And it's the place where souls return, the place where they returned after their time, up or down, and then when they went into their next life, choosing their next life and being reborn. So it includes all of that. And all of it, also I think another thing to keep in mind here is that Tartarus and the Isles of the Blessed are not exactly like heaven and hell in our Judeo-Christian sense. Instead, in the Judeo-Christian sense, we think of heaven and hell as an eternal resting place. But for the Greeks, we reincarnate, which means these are not final resting places. And our journey through many lifetimes is all guided by providence. Our time in the world of Hades is guided by providence as surely as our time in physical form. And that's key to understanding the story, that there was nothing bad about Persephone going down into the world of Hades. In fact, in the Phaedo, which we saw quoted earlier, that was the dialogue where Socrates is his last day of life, and he's talking to his friends about why he does not fear death. And he says that as philosophers, one way of thinking about philosophy is it's the study of dying and being dead. We're learning how to separate from the body. Peak experiences is really just a separation of soul from the body while we're still alive. And the separation of soul from the body at the end of our life is nothing bad. It's nothing to fear. It's part of our journey. However, before we've had this education, before we truly believe it and feel it and see it as true, we fear death. And so that's very much like Persephone's reaction the first time she saw Hades. She was terrified of him. She saw him as a devil figure, as an evil figure. And much like Persephone, most of us will only go to the world of Hades kicking and screaming. And so that's what I think is symbolized by his taking her in such a stark and violent way. Now, once she's there, she realizes that no harm comes to her. And once it is ordained that this will be her cycle, she accepts it. Now, why is she seen as wise? It's because she does accept this, and because, unlike us, when she comes back to the world of the living, she remembers her time in the underworld, in the world of Hades. So I think her being a virgin is symbolical of the fact that no matter what we experienced in our past lives or in our time in the world of Hades, when we're reborn a sweet innocent baby. And I think that's symbolized by the idea of her being a virgin. But Plato does tell us in his myth at the end of the Republic that we carry with us whatever wisdom we were able to gain in past lives. And so that's very much like Persephone, who comes back a virgin, but she still remembers the world of Hades. And because she has that wisdom, she's seen as wise. And so that's what we can see in this story. So you can see that even though the surface story is nothing defensible and there are horrible things going on here, we can understand mythological stories as showing goodness and providence. This is showing the providential goodness of this cycle of rebirth, that nothing bad happens to us in the world of Hades. So that's just to give you some idea then of how we can look at mythology in a way that is consistent with Plato's teachings and how we can bring some intelligibility to these stories. So if you like what you saw here, I do hope you'll give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. And I'm going to come back to the gods again. Now, I'm going to take a week off for the new year, and I wish you all a happy new year. Hope you all enjoy your holidays. And then when I come back, what I want to do is return to the gods, and I want to look specifically at the 12 gods that are presented in Plato's Phaedrus. So thank you very much, and I do hope you will join me next year, and I hope you all have a happy new year. Thank you so much.